Perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, we're both on Central Time. All right. So, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, thank you so much. No relation to Craig T. Nelson, right?
No, he's my uncle. No, I'm kidding.
Okay.
He's not.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah. So, the main reason I wanted to reach out and talk to you is because, like I said, I saw you speak at the NSCA's Personal Trainers Conference back in October in Anaheim.
Yeah.
And, your talk was titled 5 Ways to Become a Fat-Burning Beast. And as a personal trainer here in Chicago, it's, and I'm sure personal trainers everywhere, this is the biggest thing they hear from their clients is how do I lose fat and how quickly can I lose fat, and, especially with New Year's around the corner. So I think this is just a really relevant talk that you gave, and I think it's, it definitely applies with the new year. So I just wanted to kind of briefly discuss some of these points that you went over, as well as your work that you've done throughout your career too, that led up to this presentation.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So the main thing I think I really want to talk about a lot, that I think people tend to overthink this stuff, and a lot of it is, everyone's going to say, well, I should go low carb, or I should start going high fat, or I should go keto, or I need to make sure I'm running on the treadmill for an hour a day, whatever. But I think the most important thing that you talked about was, just going on a fasted morning walk. And would you be able to just briefly talk about that?
Yeah, so it's one of those things where I always think that as a coach or a trainer, the job is to translate kind of very complex systems physiology into actions that are simple for clients to do, right? If it was as easy as keeping it complex, well, every client you meet with, you just hand them, George Brooks's, bioenergetics textbook and be like, hey, just go home and read this, and it's $100 and come back in a week, Yeah. But it doesn't work that way. So the physiology is complex, but the actions are simple. And I think of, coaches and trainers as kind of glorified translators, not in a bad way, in a good way. And the nice thing about an AM fasted walk is that it hits at a couple things. One thing I've noticed as people have more and more Fitbits and things of that can accumulate data, I've been able to see from clients for about 3 years now or longer just how much they actually move around. And what I've noticed is that it tends to be less and less and less. And if we look at what's called the total daily energy expenditure, or TDEE, it's just simply how many calories you're burning during the day. And half of that, or over half of that, comes from your resting metabolic rate. Just, how much energy it takes to keep you upright and a higher body temperature than the air temperature around you. The other higher component is actually NEAT, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis.
Right.
But just walking around, just general movement. For most people, unless you're training for a triathlon or some huge exercise volume, that's actually higher than their exercise. And that doesn't mean that exercise is not important. It's just, I think for most people, they kind of underestimate how many calories they burn just by moving around. And what I found was by...
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's... sorry, hold on. I'm just going to mute real quick. It's
like a train going by or something?
Main Street. But I think what you mentioned with the total daily energy expenditure, so is this based on, a set number of calories, like 1,500, 2,000, or is this just kind of, does it vary from person to person about how, like, each one of us, regardless of caloric consumption, we're probably going to be burning, half our daily intake just by being alive?
Yeah, I like to think of it in terms of percentages, and the percentages map pretty close from one person to the next. So even if you have some person who's on 2,000 calories a day and someone who's on, say, 3,000 calories a day, the percentage that makes up that is relatively close. And you are correct that the sheer number, so if we add up the total number, so the total daily energy expenditure in terms of a number, that is pretty variable from one person to the next. It's also one of the hardest things to figure out exactly where someone is at, too. I mean, you can use equations that can, try to predict it, and they'll get you, in my experience, in the ballpark. But everyone's kind of trying to look for this mythical, perfect, number of calorie assessment with individuals, and I don't really think it exists. So what I do is just move things up that I know have a low cost. So like an AM walk is nice because you're directly using fat as a fuel, right? So in the morning, you haven't eaten yet, so insulin is going to be lower. So when insulin is lower, it pushes your body to use more fat. And it's a low-intensity activity. If an AM walk turns into a high-intensity activity, then you probably need to see your doctor and do something else, or take off the 90-pound backpack you decided to use or something like that. And the other benefits, too, are that it's super simple, right? Because you don't really get too many questions beforehand. It's like, well, what should I eat beforehand? No, just don't eat anything. Well, should I warm up? What should I do for my warm up? No, just go walk. If you need a warm up for a walk, you've got other orthopedic issues you need a referral or we need to figure out. So there isn't really many excuses other than time per se. And having it also be first thing in the morning, it's easier when you do your schedule to prioritize it, and then you've already kind of done it for the day. So even if you did a 5,000 step walk in the morning, and the rest of your day just turns into another crap show, you still got 5,000 steps in. Not the greatest ever, but, on top of how much you're going to move around during the day, definitely 5,000 more steps than you would have gotten if you didn't do it. And then the other couple benefits, too, are a lot of clients I've noticed have really messed up circadian rhythms. So they tend to get sleepy in the afternoon, they tend to be more tired in the morning, and more awake at night. It's kind of a hallmark that your sleep cycle is all hosed up. And by walking in the morning, or as early as you can without sunglasses, not necessarily mean you have to go out and stare at the sun, all the time if you live on the equator, but just getting that sunlight exposure into the photoreceptors in the back of the eye is one of the main things that triggers a thing in the brain called the SCN. That's kind of the master clock that regulates your sleep-wake cycle. And what you'll find then is that people feel more awake during the day and also more sleepy at night. And that's pretty huge because a lot of people don't like to go to bed early enough to get enough sleep because they don't really feel tired. And, there's other artificial light stimulus and things like that. So that's a tip I got from my buddy Dan Party, which has been super helpful. And I've noticed that if people can even get 20 to 30 minutes of sunlight exposure in the morning, they can kind of screw up some of the other stuff later in the day with, other ambient light and stuff like that and still be okay. And then the last part, too, is that when you're outside, your eyes are moving around and looking at things in the distance. Hopefully you're not just watching your feet as you're walking around, so you get more eye movement. And with a lot of the screen work that a lot of people do, your eyes tend to adjust to having that thing about a foot away from your face, right? So just like if you sit all day, your hip flexors are going to feel a little tight and a little quote-unquote short because they're in that shortened position all day. It's just an adaptation. So the muscles around the eye are not really that different. And by going outside, you have what's called a focal accommodation. You have to look, farther away. You also have a bigger range of eye movement, right? Instead of looking at a 12-inch by 12-inch screen or 19-inch or whatever, you have to look all different places. So I tell people when they're on a walk, just look up at the trees, try to look up towards the sky. Not necessarily have to stare at the sky all day, but look, do you see any birds at the tops of the trees? Do you see anything off to your left? Do you see anything off to your right? So trying to get their eyes to be a little bit more opened up. And if you've ever done a lot of computer work, even just doing some simple eye movement exercises afterwards, a lot of people will feel a lot better, right?
Right.
If you've ever noticed when people get super tired, you'll see that a lot of the just sort of small reflexive eye movements they have kind of go away also. Or someone is super stressed, you'll see those kind of go away too. So that's kind of some of the reasons I think is that it's an easy thing to do. Again, scheduling and making it a priority are always challenges. That provides a lot of benefit, and it doesn't interfere with anything else, right? You can do a lot of walking before it's really going to mess up your exercise performance or recovery, and most of the time the opposite. I found that it actually helps both of those.
Yeah, definitely. I think it just goes. It helps with pretty much everything. At least I've found, because even getting outside, and look, there are days where it's going to be rainy or cold, things like that, and you try not to make your excuses. But even if you just go to the treadmill and you're staring out the window or something like that, you're not going to have the same effect, obviously, but you're still going to be, getting that fasted AM walk. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about just off that was fasted higher intensity workout. So say like you want to start your day off, before you eat anything, you're going to be either doing squats, or you're just going to do some standard movements like push-ups and curls, all these kinds of moves. Do you recommend that with general population clients, people you've worked with in the past?
Yeah, there's a couple interesting things on that. So if I program it, I will generally program higher intensity stuff similar to weight training. So if someone comes in, one of the first things I'm going to ask them, and most of the stuff I do now is all online, and the main thing I look at, I have these huge forms they all fill out of everything, and one of the first things I actually look at, other than their goals, and I've had a phone call with them already, is how much time they can dedicate to exercise and what they've done already. So if they tell me, hey, I'm busy, I've got kids, I've got a job, but I can get to the gym, I can dedicate an hour of time training Monday through Friday, right? Maybe I can do some fasted walk in the morning or something like that, which doesn't require any equipment. So in my head I go, okay, so I've got about an hour each day, Monday through Friday, to work with. I've got 5 hours total. What is going to be the biggest bang for their buck for, say, body comp and maybe some performance? So in general, I'm going to have them do some type of weight training Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Depending on how healthy they are, I may add in an interval day, maybe on like a Thursday, and then Tuesday maybe a lower intensity rowing or something like that. And again, that'll vary a fair amount. Some people maybe low intensity work on Thursday. So most of the time, when they're doing strength training or high intensity work, I do like having them be more in a fed state. So having carbohydrates and protein, coming sometime around that training. You don't need to get neurotic about it and time it down to 47.5 minutes before or anything like that.
Right, which I've done.
Yeah, I've done that too. And again, it can work. It's just for all the energy you're going to spend to try to make something better, not the biggest leverage, not the biggest return there. And I like that because you're pushing them to use more carbohydrates at that time. And I find that performance generally is going to be a little bit better. Recovery is going to be a little bit better. So that's what I normally do first. There's a couple of interesting cases where you may not do that. So the model I like to use is what's called a eustress model. So EUSTRESS. And that means that a eustress is a stress that's relatively easy to recover from. Meaning that if you go to the gym Monday and you do some bench press and say some accessory work, a couple days, you're probably going to be okay again, right? If you go in Monday and we just try to utterly crush you by doing forced reps and eccentrics and maxing out and whatever else, it's going to be several days before you're going to be kind of back to performance again. So the second way would be more of a distress model. So with eustress, it's stress you can generally recover from. So I like matching the macronutrients to the stress. So if you're weight training, you're primarily using carbohydrates. So then I like matching carbohydrates in and around that time to weight training. If we have you do the inverse of that, so we have you do, let's say, some super high intensity work, and we have you do it after an overnight fast, that would be a little bit more on the distress side. So we're pushing insulin levels lower. In the morning, liver glycogen, so stored carbohydrates in the liver, are going to be lower. Muscle glycogen is not really going to be changed all that much by just an overnight fast. But we're not providing you any carbohydrates or protein or anything before that exercise. And what's interesting is that the stress from that exercise will be a little bit higher. It'll be more of a closer to a distress stress. An older study that was done on this, and you can look up an article I did for T-Nation called 30 Seconds to Leanness. They had two groups where they had them do like a Wingate type bike exercise. If you've ever done a Wingate, it's really brutal. We used to do them in the lab all the time and take a running bet to see how many people would puke after it. And you get on a bike and you pedal as hard as you can at a very low wattage, 50, 100 watts. And then all of a sudden, either using an electronically braked one or the special bikes we have that's got this little thing that changes the tension on the wheel, you ramp them up to several hundred watts instantaneously, and you keep pedaling as hard as you can for 20 to 30 seconds. And it doesn't sound that bad, but you first start it and you're like, it's not too bad. And about halfway through, you're like, whoa, this kind of sucks. And like 5 seconds later, you're like, oh my God, it feels like someone filled my legs full of concrete. Or if you do a 500-meter sprint like on a Concept 2 rower, right? You can get some pretty high power output that way too. But doing that in a fasted state, they did I believe it was a Wingate test in this, and they split the people into two groups. They had one group that got the carbohydrate type solution beforehand, another group that did not get a carbohydrate solution. And they were looking at downstream signaling effects of leptin. So leptin is one of the hormones that kind of controls appetite a little bit, and is sort of like a body fat thermostat, right? So leptin levels pretty goodly associated with how much body fat you have.
Okay.
And what they found was in the group that did that fasted, the signaling effect for leptin was actually better, right? Better meaning that it would promote someone to be a little bit leaner. Unfortunately, I haven't never seen a follow-up to that study, and I've never seen a body count follow-up to that study. So it's an acute signaling study, so we don't know, how much of that will be, followed up in a chronic study. But for people who've been just really stuck for whatever reason, I have thrown that in like once or twice a week, and it seems to help. Again, who knows? And what was interesting is that the group that got the carbohydrate solution, they did not see the beneficial effects on leptin. And the group that did not get the carbohydrate did see the beneficial effects on leptin signaling. And it was literally, I think, only once they were warmed up, 1 30-second work output. So very short. So I think that may be beneficial if people get, kind of closer to a plateau and get kind of stuck. And then the last phase, which is by far the most stressful, is if we have you do some type of high-intensity exercise, we can have you do an overnight fast, which will deplete liver glycogen levels, and then we can have you do some type of high-output or glycolytic, so carbohydrate-using work, for quite a while to purposely deplete muscle glycogen. And that kind of work is very brutal. You're not going to be able to drive muscle glycogen to zero, but you can drive it down a fair amount. So a lot of times in the study that they would do that in the afternoon, and then they would maybe just give them a small amount of protein, and then that would be it. So they would not give them more carbohydrates, they would not give them more calories, and then the next morning they would come back and do some other type of training. Could be high intensity or some other type of work. And so the second session, the next day, you are now executing that under low liver glycogen and also lower muscle glycogen. And what they find is that these molecular adaptations actually go up quite a bit. And in one of the studies they did, which was only a 3-week study that I talked about at the conference, they did show body comp changes there, which were measured by DEXA, and they did show some pretty nice performance bumps after doing this. I think it was just a couple times a week for 3 weeks. The hard part about that is, if you've ever done it, it's incredibly brutal. It's not fun. If you measure markers of stress, like heart rate variability, you will see them acutely tank. You can, if you do it too long, you can run into immune compromise issues. Carbohydrates do have a beneficial effect during training on the immune system. So it's a tool that I think can be used in more advanced athletes or advanced clients, but not really overused that much. So it's one of those things where I like it, and it's cool to talk about because it gives us some insight into the physiology. But if you noticed in the conference, I presented that as the last method because it's the most invasive. Most people probably don't need to do anything that intense. With my own clients, I've only done it just a handful of times. But it gives you an idea of a framework and a perspective to kind of wrap your head around it a little bit.
Oops, hold on. I think you may have cut out just a bit.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you again.
There we go.
Yeah, but the nice part is that it's useful, but it's also very intense. So it's one of those things that, yeah, it can be a tool that you can use, but it's not the main tool you're going to use all the time. And you may never get to that point with some clients. But if you have someone who's more of an advanced athlete or advanced client, they're kind of stuck with where they're at. I think in that case, it can definitely be very useful.
Yeah, definitely. And so for, a general population client, say like, someone who's just looking to get started, I know you talk about when it comes to not necessarily maybe an anabolic window, but when it comes to training or nutrition prior to training and then after training, especially if you're doing a, like you mentioned, an interval training or weight training session, do you recommend like a 2-to-1 carbs to protein ratio after?
Yeah, so usually pre and post, if I were to put numbers on it, I do kind of like about a 2-to-1-ish ratio, sometimes even 1-to-1, right? So amount of carbohydrates you're looking at, 40 to 80. Again, this is going to vary a lot depending on the person and how many carbs they're at. And protein, 20 to 40 grams. 20 grams of whey protein is enough to kick off what's called muscle protein synthesis, which is the building of up muscle tissue again. And that needs to have leucine as the kind of the thing that starts it. So about 2.5 to 3.5 grams of leucine, which is an essential amino acid. And then also the other essential amino acids for the building blocks. So the analogy I use that years ago I actually worked on a assembly line putting heads on Pocahontas dolls, which was horrible. So these little kid care molded shampoo bottles that looked like Pocahontas. Not a fun job. But
I can imagine.
Yeah, but if you use an assembly line to make something, right, you need energy to run it. You need to start the assembly line, and then you need some type of raw material. So for building up of muscle tissue, and this also can apply to other tissues also, for muscle, leucine is the main thing that starts the assembly line. So about 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine or so, 3.5. And then you need some type of essential amino acids. So those are your raw materials that you're using to build new muscle. And then some type of energy in order to run that. So usually that's why adding more muscle is also much, much easier in caloric surplus. So the nice part about a whey protein is that, there's some calories to it. You have enough leucine and you have enough essential amino acids. Another trick is if you just tell someone to get a dose of around 40 grams of protein, the type of protein doesn't matter as much then, because even if you use something like a rice protein, you are going to have enough leucine and enough essential amino acids at that point, just because you have a much higher dose. So to keep it simple, sometimes I'll tell clients, get 30 to 40 grams of protein, at each meal, knowing that I'm going to cover most of those requirements.
Gotcha. And then carb sources, those should be like, rice or like half potato, something like that, if you're saying you're shooting for 40 to 80 grams carb.
Yeah, usually the starchier ones just make your life a lot easier. I mean, the amount of broccoli you need to eat and then try to lift, that's not going to end well.
Yeah.
So I do like rice, sweet potatoes, oatmeal, dates, spotted bananas, things that can travel pretty easy. I don't think the glycemic index is useful at all. But the one thing I have noticed is that higher glycemic index foods tend to be digested a little bit better by most people. And for pre-training, I find that can be useful. Some people can go and eat something an hour before and train. Yeah, they're going to be fine. Other people, it's going to be, 2 hours before. So having a little bit on the more, I guess, simple carbohydrates, although I kind of dislike that term too. Usually people report that they just feel much better during training,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about the glycemic index, because it makes me never want to have a Granny Smith apple again because it's still the lowest glycemic. So
yeah, and just look up carrots, right? You'll get really confused.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, wait a minute, they have a higher glycemic index, but the glycemic load is low, but not all the data says they have a higher glycemic index. But if you make carrot juice, then it's really high. And well, now if you cook them, and it's just a debacle.
It's always, there's always something new. So then just another part, I mean, when we're kind of on the topic of fasting, you do recommend intermittent fasting. This is something I've been kind of dabbling with over the last few years, just trying to see, what works best for me, whether it's skipping breakfast or, skipping lunch, or, just trying to do a 16 to 8 eating window. Have you found anything that works for most people in terms of when it comes to weight loss, lower insulin, and then just overall general benefits of intermittent fasting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting. I always need to qualify that, because intermittent fasting, now you say that to people and they're like, oh, you mean the 16 and 8? Oh, you mean doing one 24-hour fast? Oh, you mean just putting fat in my coffee? So it has all different types of definitions. So when I mean intermittent fasting, I'm just saying that there's a period of time where you're not consuming any calories. If you're putting coconut oil and butter in your coffee, yes, oil doesn't have a real insulin response, but you're still consuming calories, right? So the definition of intermittent fasting, it would not fit for that per se. Now it would be a lower insulin condition, which is a different discussion. So I've tried a whole bunch of different ones over time. I mean, the one that I like the most is taking 1 day per week and just doing a longer fast, which initially I got this from Brad Pilon from Eat Stop Eat. And 19 to 24 hours is where I have most people kind of shoot for. And initially that'll be on your off training day or just your low intensity aerobic type day. And the goal with that is you're trying to find an easy way to cut out a whole bunch of calories, right? I found that just anecdotally fasting for people was easier than putting them on a very low calorie day. And I've noticed that with myself. And I don't know if that's a mental thing or a physical thing. It's hard. You can't do a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial with a fasting versus a non-fasting group, right? The fasting group obviously knows that they're fasting. There was an older study where they did do something similar. They had subjects eat these like food-like paste substances. I think one group was around 2,000 calories, and the other group was around like 350 calories for about 48 hours. And what they saw was, even without any practice, the fasting group, right, or the super low-calorie group, actually reported and did fine. So maybe it's all more of a psychologic thing, who knows. But I will have people work up to that slowly. If they want to do one fast, say on Monday, for 19 to 24 hours, over about 6 to 8 weeks, they're just going to slowly push out breakfast, and then eventually they'll drop breakfast or replace it with lunch. And they'll take just that 1 day per week and move their fast out just by a couple hours per week. All right, so this is the biggest mistake I made when I first started doing it. I read the book and I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm going to, I was eating every 2 to 3 hours at the time. And I'm going to do a 24-hour fast on Monday. I was traveling for a certification. I got about 14 hours into it and went across the street to the Chinese buffet and ate a whole bunch of food.
Right? That's happened more times than I like to admit.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I wasn't too bright, so I kept doing that a couple times. And I'm like, oh, this fasting stuff is so stupid. Why do people do this? And then I realized, I'm like, well, wait a minute. If, while I'm awake, I'm used to eating every 2 to 3 hours at that time. And my sleep was about an 8-hour window where I wasn't eating. It'd be like someone coming to the gym in my garage and be like, hey, I've never deadlifted before. Oh, cool. Let's start at, 4 plates aside. And if you don't make it, I'll just yell at you to try harder. Unless you're Andy Bolton in high school, it's not going to work so well. So just, start at 95 pounds, 135, what are the bar? It doesn't matter. Just start whatever is in your current capacity and then scale up from there. So once people get up to about a...
Yes, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Do you recommend taking any electrolyte solutions, anything like that, or just sea salt?
No,
water?
I don't think so. I mean, if you're out in an extreme environment or it's super humid or something like that, then yeah, you're going to need to. If you're inside in a climate-controlled area, I don't really think it's going to matter that much. And I think the nice part about the progressive nature is that if there is any issue, your body's going to kind of accommodate to it. So I tell people, just, eat what you normally would before and after, drink the same amount of water you normally would. If you want black coffee, I don't think that's going to be a big deal breaker. But make it progressive. And then I always have clients log, what was the meal you had after, and then how did you feel? Because if it's like, oh, I was doing 14-hour fast and it was great, the last, 6 hours were miserable, I wanted to kill myself, and then I ate twice as much once I was done. Nope, go back to 14 hours and then try 15 hours next week, right? You're trying to make it a eustress model where you're giving just a little bit more stress, but your body can get used to that. And I find that typically most people can do pretty good within 6 to 8 weeks. They can hit a 19 to 24-hour fast pretty easily. And then one other tip I found too is that having it be evening to evening normally is better for most people. So if you're going to do your fast, say Monday, Sunday night you can have normal dinner with your family, get up in the morning, maybe just have a cup of coffee, go to work all day, come back, and let's say your dinner is normally scheduled again at 7 p.m., have your normal dinner at 7 p.m. I got this from Brad Pilon also. Just pretend like your fast never happened, and then just go about the rest of your week, right? And I find that way you're not socially being super awkward and your whole family's eating and you're staring at a glass of water, you know?
Yeah.
So it kind of fits in that way too.
Awesome. Yeah. Plus, I mean, that would stimulate like a growth hormone response, right?
It does, but I don't know if that makes any damn difference. I think growth hormone is more of pushing fuel sources in the body than anything else. I mean, yes, it is true that we do have a growth hormone pulse from sleep. Yes, that does decrease as we age. If you look at athletes that use exogenous growth hormone, which usually is illegal, but that's usually more for the soft tissue effects, not so much muscle. So even in high levels, growth hormone doesn't appear to do much for muscle. It does, however, push the body to use more fat. Right? So you find that growth hormone and insulin are opposites. So if you are fasting, you're absolutely correct. The growth hormone will go up. And I think that's more of a fuel selector. Yeah, there's some tissue repair stuff too, but I think that's generally been a little bit overrated. And when growth hormone is higher, it's pushing your body to use more fat as a fuel.
Gotcha. Sweet. All right, so one last thing I just briefly want to talk about, and again, I want to be mindful of time so we can talk as little or as much as we want in 5 minutes.
No worries.
So we did mention briefly on the bulletproof coffee, such as putting coconut oil and butter in your coffee, starting off your day with fat, because you do mention in the talk briefly about the ketogenic diet, and that's one that's becoming pretty popularized and mainstream. So what have you found has been effective with people who are looking to start keto, and what do you think are some of the downsides with it becoming, this mainstream thing, and what's constantly getting overlooked?
Yeah, so the biggest question I ask people, and I do have clients that do use a ketogenic diet, so I'm not completely against it. I get crazy emails from both people. I get people that think I hate the ketogenic diet, and I get people that think that it's the greatest thing ever, and they both email me opposites. So, the biggest question is I ask people is, what is your goal? So the first question I'll ask them is, well, why do you want to do a ketogenic diet? If they say, well, I just want to lose fat. Okay, yeah, ketogenic diet may be okay for that, but there's a lot of other nutrition approaches that can work just fine for that too. If they tell me that I don't exercise all that much, I'm not planning to exercise anytime soon, I go walk the dogs in the morning, but I don't like going to the gym, I don't like doing formal exercise per se, may be useful, right? I mean, I think exercise is going to be beneficial, but you kind of have to pick your battles with, where clients are at too. So in that case, I think it definitely can be useful at that point. If you say, I want to be a CrossFit Games competitor, or high-level strongman competitor or something like that, where you're doing a lot of glycolytic work, so work that uses carbohydrates as a fuel, so higher intensity exercise, oh boy, your life's going to be pretty friggin' miserable, and you're probably not going to make it, right? Because your exercise that you've chosen to do is burning through a ton of carbohydrates. Or if you say, I want to be, do the Ironman triathlete in Kona. Yeah, good luck with that. Maybe if you want to do an ultra endurance run, maybe. I think the data on that's pretty mixed. If you say, I want to do a obstacle course race that's 24 hours and we have to carry all of our own food and all of our own supplies the entire time, we can't use any stations to pick up food or gear, yeah, that might be more useful then, right? So I think that's the biggest thing. So if you're not doing a lot of high-intensity exercise, I think it can be beneficial. If you want to do more of that high-output glycolytic work, so far to date, I haven't really seen that work all that well. Now, you can do it, but you're probably going to give up 5 to 10%-ish off your top end. And if you're not an ultra-competitive person, then, or competing where you're against everybody else, yeah, that might be all right? You're just saying, I'm going to take this little bit of a trade-off here. That's something I want to test out and try. Okay, that's all right. So I think the biggest problem is that everybody wants to use a ketogenic diet to solve every issue. And the answer is, it depends. So once you get through that, the other part is looking at how you're actually doing a ketogenic diet. So I've gotten some diet records from people, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a debacle. Their protein's usually too high. So like the standard fitness person, their protein's way too high.
Yep.
They're pretty good at getting their carbs low, and their fat's usually way too low. So they get stuck in this, what I call the metabolic no man's zone, where your carbs are 50 grams or less, so it's really hard for you to feel good on that low amount of carbohydrates. Your protein's relatively high, so you can then convert protein into carbohydrates, which is true, but that's a pretty slow process. It's probably not going to occur at a fast enough rate to really power you through a lot of high-intensity exercise. And then your fat is also too low, so you don't have enough fat being cycled through the liver to create ketone bodies as the alternate fuel. And when your protein is high, insulin does go up a little bit more, and that is enough a lot of times to bump you out of ketosis. So ketosis is just this band area, I would say, or area where you're producing enough ketone bodies, primarily BHB, so beta-hydroxybutyrate, and there's two other ones, but that's shifting your body to use that as a primary fuel. But the thing that will knock you out of ketosis is insulin. So when your insulin levels are higher, ketone production gets driven down to almost zero. And I think the best way to view ketosis, or being in a ketogenic state, is a backup system to your metabolism. So it primarily was designed, I believe, for starvation. We take people, we deprive them of all food, let's say for quite a while, let's say 3-4 days. Even someone who spent a lifelong habit of eating donuts and 7-Eleven Slurpees without ice, they can probably still get into ketosis. And that to me is just mind-boggling. The fact that your body will spend resources to keep that backup system around, even though it's never really been executed in most people's entire life. That to me is like fascinating. So I think that's some data to say that it is important and useful. Does that mean we need to hang out and be there 24/7 for the rest of our life? I don't think so. Again, if it works with your goals and what you want to do, maybe if you get into the neurology side, maybe if you've got some TBI or you've got some other brain issues that you're working on, yep, that can definitely be beneficial. If you look up some of the literature, like seizures and epilepsy, a ketogenic diet is extremely useful for that, way better than any type of drugs or medication currently. So again, going back to the question, I think it depends on what is your goal, what are you trying to do. If you decide that you do want to try it and it does fit those criteria, work with someone that knows what the hell's going on, right? So that when you're doing a ketogenic approach, you actually are doing a ketogenic approach, and then you're probably going to need to measure blood levels of ketones. You can get different ways to do it now. I use a Precision Extra to do it when I'm doing more of that approach. The little strips are kind of expensive. They're around $3-4 a strip. But, just to do it a few times to know where you're at and to know what that feels like. And then kind of adjust from there. So, but keep in mind, if you're a strength and power athlete, and I wrote an article on this too for Dr. Annie Gelpin's editorial comment in the Journal of the NSCA, you will lose some high-end use of carbohydrates. And if that's not that high of a priority to you, not much to worry about. If you're trying to be super competitive, burning through a bunch of carbohydrates and you take them out, you're probably not going to do so well on the high end. So,
great. All right. Well,
again, a little bit of a long-winded answer.
Yeah. No. I think you went over on your own time. So I was going to say, I just wanted to say thanks again for taking the time. If people are listening, what is the best way to read your content, to follow you, everything like that?
Yeah, so best way is probably just the website. It's just the MikeTNelson.com, MikeTNelson.com. They can get on the newsletter there, and that's probably where most of my content right now goes out. Find out everything there. And then I do have a certification that covers all of this in exercise and how nutrition fits in using concepts of flexible dieting and metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility is just simply how well you can use fat and carbohydrates, and that's just at flexdiet.com. So FLEXDIET.com, and you can go there and get all the information about that, and I still have that on my site too. So, yeah, and where people are in Chicago, where can they find more info about you?
Oh, for me, I'm currently under construction right now, but usually if they just go to my YouTube channel, I just have exercises, some interviews. So that's just my name, Duncan Salick, DUNCANSALEK.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I appreciate you.
Cool. Thanks.